Stanford University.
Welcome to EE380. I've been promoting today's talk on how a couple of brave individuals managed to kill a large ISP that was doing nothing but spamming us. Well, their day jobs have interfered. They're all in Europe or something. And so we called on an old friend to do a pinch hit talk for us. And I'm particularly excited because usually when we get talks in EE380, they're prepared. The person has done them several times and has thought through and really has something. Not to say that today's speaker isn't prepared, but the thoughts are still fresh, and he's still working it out. So we're going to get something we don't get, which is we're going to see somebody developing ideas real time. And parts of this won't ever appear again. Parts of this will be on ABC News and all those other cool places. But we were here first. Earlier this quarter, we had a nice talk on how information had to become scarce in an information age. Stones weren't scarce in the Stone Age, so I'm not quite sure about that. But today's talk is about another transformation of the information age, how information is becoming media. And in a world where if you put on a bad Star Wars costume and dance around, I guess that's true, but there's more to it than that, and today's talk is about that. Today's speaker, Paul Saffo, is an old friend of 380. He's given several talks in the past, and that's having an old friend as a futurist is sort of interesting because you get to go back and say, well, did it happen? Did it happen? And that means he has to be good. So today's speaker, Paul Saffo.
It's funny you say that because I just yesterday got an email from someone who read a piece I wrote in Wired in like 1993 titled Cyberpunk RIP. And he sent me an email and he said, I see you were completely wrong. Yeah. And I read it and I said, well, I think I was right. But of course, my note to him was, you're right. You're right. Which is always the easiest thing to do on email because, whoever sent it had some deep psychic need to tell me I was wrong, and probably would be a bad idea to say, well, actually, I was right. So what I'm going to do is talk about something that I've been talking about for a while, but I'm going to fast forward through the obvious parts and share, I think, out loud about some of the implications. So I'm going to start at this notion of media and information, and I'm going to end up with what I think is happening to the economy and why the collapse, Black Sunday, September of 2008, is actually marking a shift from one economy to another. Speculate a little bit about the future of robotics, that I think that's the next hot thing, and talk about why all of this means that the United States probably won't exist 50 years from now. So I'm among close friends. It sort of depends on the details. It's either going to be a nice, kumbaya sort of European community kind of thing, or, Kosovo. But we'll get to that. So I'm going to go through some assumptions up front. I'm going to go through them a little fast. Bear with me. And I also, again, because I was pinch hitting, here Dennis called me, and everybody in this room knows never say no to Dennis Allison. And so I pulled some slides together, but I'm not quite sure the order I pulled them together in, so we'll see how we go. This just briefly, we do in fact live in the media age, but it's not just the media age. As a forecaster, I actually think this is a pretty darn good forecast. If you read it closely, it says, hunt for bin Laden, experts agree, Al-Qaeda leader is dead or alive. It's a good forecast because it accurately captures the uncertainty of the situation. And as a forecaster, what I often see a lot of people, the biggest mistake they make when they do a forecast is they pretend to know more. They pretend for things to be more certain, which is, that's like whistling past the graveyard. It's an invitation to be shown you're wrong. And of course, the answer to this is, do we know? Is bin Laden alive or dead? We have no idea. The answer is we don't know. So it's actually...
It's a definite maybe, right?
It's an absolute definite maybe. The one thing we do know is that as expected, that Osama stayed in his job longer than George Bush did. I'm also going to mention a couple of forecast rules just as context of all of this. And this one, going to the first rule, every year at Davos, which just ended, I always host a dinner called the Nerds Dinner, appropriately enough. And one of the conceits of the Nerds Dinner is everybody has to answer a forecasting question. And the question I asked last year was a good example of this rule. When change clusters at the extreme, it is a sure bet that more fundamental change lies ahead. So a year ago in December, I noticed an interesting pattern. That's the price of Google stock at the top there. And that's the gold price it's from 1975 to then December. And a very odd thing was happening in December. Google was approaching its record all-time high stock price. And gold was also reaching its all-time high spot market price in the London Exchange. And for me as a forecaster, that set off all sorts of alarms. Because usually when stocks are high, gold is low, and when gold is high, stocks are low, and both were high. And I was saying privately to the small number of people who actually listened to me for advice, grab your seatbelts, because something big is coming down the line. And I asked my nerd friends at dinner to forecast where gold and Google would be in 12 months. And the results were fascinating, but the dinner's off record, so I can't tell you how they did. But I bring this up because this is exactly what's happening in the information and media space today. Change is clustering at the extremes. On the one hand, we have bookstores closing. On the other hand, Amazon is doing record sales. We have all sorts of interesting new tools, Wikipedia, Kindle, all these other things, and schools can't buy computers, and everybody's worried about, the corrupting influence of information technology and the like, which always amuses me. It's sort of like people 100 years ago complaining that their kids were spending too much time reading books and not enough time outdoors. These days, parents would drop in a faint if their kids were actually outdoors, or actually inside reading. It's a period of vast uncertainty, and vast uncertainty in media, opposites happening all at the same time. And to me, what it is a sure sign that more fundamental change lies ahead. And that change, in my opinion, is a double shift. From information to media, and of course that's not a new idea, lots of people have said it. Nick Negroponte even named a whole institution at some East Coast school that tries to be like Stanford. He called it the Media Lab for the reason that he thought it was a shift from information to media. So we've been trying to get our heads around that for almost 2 decades. The shift that's more important is that, yes, this is a shift from an information age to a media age. And it's a shift specifically because information was a term that really only makes sense to people like Claude Shannon and computer science professors. Information makes sense when there's not very much of it and what there is isn't very important. Sort of like 1994. When information becomes truly ubiquitous and goes deep into our culture, it ceases to be information and it becomes media, and it's invisible, we don't even think about it. So the more there is, the less visible it becomes. It's a media revolution, but the media revolution with a difference. I think we're in a moment of a shift from the old mass media order to a new personal media order. And again, by now you're saying, wait a second, it's 4:15, I could be headed home for an early drink. I've heard the words personal and media for absolute ever. There's nothing new to them. There are 2 kinds of words in our vocabulary. There are those entirely new words that appear in the night sky like a star supernovaing. It's Tycho Brahe seeing this nova and realizing that the universe is changing and not fixed. And it draws our attention to something we never thought about before. Words like blog and all the neologisms of the internet world. Then there are those words that have been around forever, like personal and media, and we take them for granted and we don't even think about them. And underneath, the meanings of those words are changing in a profound way. And a personal media revolution is a profound, profound shift in my opinion, because it's a world where we shift from being passive viewers to active participants. And I'll go deeply into this in a little bit, but it's the difference. Mass media world, that was McLuhan. Wonders came into our lives, but all we did is press our nose against the glass and watch. In a personal media world, it's not that you can participate, it's that if you don't participate, you don't have the experience. You know, think about Google, which is the quintessential personal media platform. You don't watch Google. I mean, those of you in this room old enough to remember Cheech and Chong, just show of hands, Cheech and Chong. And you remember, hey man, what are you watching? Oh, I'm watching this really boring cowboy and Indians movie. Well, he's watching the test pattern on the television when they used to have the Indian chief. Watching Google would be about that boring. You got to put something in to get something out. So profound, profound shift. And I think this moment is like 1953 and the birth of the mass media industry back then. And everything, absolutely everything's becoming media. My cell phone is not a cell phone anymore. It's not a communications device. It's a media platform. You know, we more than almost 10 years into the whole ringtone listing business. I think, well, actually, we are more than 10 years. 1998 was the first ringtone sales, and the ringtone industry today is a fifth the size of the global music industry. Cell phones aren't communications devices, they're media devices. There are more cameras in cell phones than there are sold as a standalone device. And mercifully, there's still more cameras in cell phones than there are on telephone poles in our cities, though I suspect that will change fairly soon. This is a media revolution. It's a personal media revolution. And it's like looking at the last one through a funhouse mirror. But if you do look back, and I recommend that, one of the rules I follow as a forecaster is always look back twice as far as you're looking forward. You know, Mark Twain is alleged to have said, we in fact don't know who really said it, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. And technology history, turns out, rhymes in really interesting ways. And I really do think this moment is like this moment. Winky Dink and You, the first interactive television program. It's actually, for this crowd, there's an interesting story behind this. This was terrible interaction. You did it with an acetate screen and a grease pen. It was actually a modest success for about 4 years and then was abruptly pulled off the air in 1957. Does anyone want to guess why?
Copyright?
Good guess. Not the answer.
Porn.
Come on. Okay, double E's. Raise your hand. Okay. Thank you, sir. This poor child has got their face 6 inches away from a 1950s era cathode ray tube that is improperly shielded. And parents suddenly realized their children's brains were being irradiated. This gentleman is a member of Congress today.
That's why.
It's a period, but that period is like today, a period of wild, crazy experimentation. The guy who started Winky Dink and You went on to become a big pioneer in the business. His name was Jack Barry. He basically invented the game show. But here's the equivalent of Winky Dink and You today. How many people have seen Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog when it came out earlier? Good to see you, sir. Okay, you go back and look at Dr. Horrible. How many people have been on Hulu.com? This is the fastest growing television network. They came from basically not being in existence 12 months ago to having enough money and wealth to do a Super Bowl ad this year. This is fundamental change. And Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog is interesting to me. I'm a little surprised that more of you haven't seen it. It is what it says. It's a sing-along blog. It's little short episodes where people break out in song, and it's a drama, and it's about a guy and a girl, and evil and good, and yes, in fact, that is Doogie Howser in that picture, and who would have guessed that Doogie Howser can sing?
Was it really his voice?
It really was his voice, and it was done on a shoestring, with people working off, not doing union stuff. And it had a phenomenal following. I'm not sure if it's still on because they started charging for it and I'm too cheap to pay, so I stopped watching. But this is the classic period of wild-eyed experimentation, new technology coming in, and everybody said, you know, the media experience is changing. People no longer want to watch long-form video. They want to watch short-form, and how can we create new media experiences that go to all sorts of different kinds of devices? Well, there's a pattern to this media thing. A technology arrives, television arrived in the 1930s. Time passes, usually about 20 years, and you get its media expression. So the technology was TV. The media expression starting in 1951, the year that television started going up its inflection point on the S-curve, was the medium of broadcast and mass media. But let me mention some technologies that we don't think of as media technologies at all. Time sharing, 1960s. What was its media expression? Email, taking off in the 1980s. Obviously, email, was invented much earlier, but that was the point at which consumers got their hands on it. Now I see puzzled looks on people's faces. And you say, email, that's a communications medium. That's not a media, that's information. Okay, so how many people in this room know people who got married because of email? People who got divorced because of email? People who got fired because of email? And look at your inbox. What percentage of your email, even after you take out all the spam, is actually essential information in a Claude Shannon-esque sense of stuff you actually need to know? It's an entertainment medium. Of course it's a medium. And jump ahead, client-server technology, its 1990s expression was the World Wide Web. We tried to do the web earlier, but the architecture was all wrong with time sharing and mainframes and the like. And so trying to do, and there were people who, of course, proposed things like the World Wide Web in the time-sharing world. And they were looked at in the same manner of puzzled confusion as those folks in the 1960s who said, I know exactly what computers should be used for. They should be used for word processing. Well, back then the cycle was a terrible thing to waste. And we only use computers for important things like balancing the books at General Motors or defending the United States against missiles coming in from the Soviet Union. Architecture changes, the web becomes just what it is. And jumping ahead, I don't think I've quite got this right, but peer-to-peer, what's its media expression? I don't think it's here yet, but we got a hint with Napster.
Excuse me, why isn't email peer-to-peer?
Well, here's an interesting pattern of this, that email first emerged in a time-sharing world. Think of CompuServe, the source, and all of that. And actually, you make a good point, because one interesting thing about this is a technology arrives, time passes, you get its media expression, and it makes email possible, but email doesn't take off yet. You remember the ideal customer for CompuServe was the person who paid their credit card bill every month and didn't mind that $20 charge, but actually didn't use the email much because it was possible but not affordable. And it wasn't until email shifted to client-server that it became so cheap, that it became free. I mean, and this is the kind of thing that happens with media. Imagine walking up to Steve Case in 1992 when he had a little company called Quantum Link. It wasn't even called AOL yet. And you say, Steve, make your money really fast and sell it to an unsuspecting large media company because before the end of the decade, email is going to be so cheap, it'll be free. Well, it would have seemed very unlikely, but of course that's exactly what happened. So what this means is client-server made the World Wide Web possible. The web still is trying to migrate to peer-to-peer. It hasn't quite made it. And I think what matters here is that the web exists, but we really haven't seen the revolution begin. And that when it takes off, it's going to be in the media, personal media space. And we're seeing more hints of it in terms of cloud computing. I'll come back to the Kindle because I think the Kindle is a hugely important indicator in this space. How many people have a Kindle? What problem do you have with Kindle, sir?
Laptop is good enough.
Oh, you must be. You're a double E, right?
Sure, I want everything off it. I don't want a machine that can't do anything.
Okay, well, we'll get back to, we're gonna have it, yeah, and,
Dennis and I
If I had an
discussed,
iPhone first, I wouldn't have bought a Kindle. I mean, this works great for me.
Yeah.
It looks-
I agree with him.
okay, well,
Dennis and I discussed getting a Kindle speaker for creation. And it was Dennis's opinion that Kindle isn't quite there yet. That's,
it's coming fast, I have a new one coming out next week. Okay, well, this is actually,
What about radio? Isn't that broadcast? Speaking of looking back,
yeah, no, radio would be an example, I just didn't put everything up here, but,
speaking of looking back, I was just curious.
yeah, I mean, I could
List it off.
well, I can take this back to, 1452, but I won't do that, because it's late in the day. Change is never linear, this is real fast, this is slides I pulled from a talk I actually did here before. It looks like this. Everything interesting looks like an S-curve, except of course in Silicon Valley, we don't do S-curves, we do hockey sticks. Because nothing ever goes, which is why, as they say, venture. Right, it just crashes and down. Well, here's the problem with S-curves, is we tend to, and this, thank God we do this, we constantly draw our expectations as a linear line, so we overestimate the short term, and we underestimate the long term. And we make an industry out of this in Silicon Valley. You know, this is Doug Engelbart. You know, this is every inventor who's had a really good idea, and everybody mistakes a clear view for a short distance, thinks everything's going to arrive much more quickly than we expect. And just before it arrives, they throw up their hands, they say, ugh, I was wrong, it'll never happen at all, and they walk away just as the industry's taken over by, someone else to do it. Nothing new here. And the other thing to keep in mind in terms of Kindle is this rule: cherish failure, especially when it's somebody else's failure. Because that flat spot of the S-curve, which usually is about 20 years, is paved by the corpses of all the attempts to do things and fail. Okay? My favorite example of this is outside of technology. It's Columbus. Columbus was not the first European to the New World. He was just the first European to make it back. I mean, yeah, there were some Norwegians, Leif Erikson made it back, but he made the mistake of, he landed in a cold, foggy place, and when he came back and everybody said, hey, Leif, what'd you find? He said, oh, it's great, there are lots of trees, and it's really foggy, and it's cold, and there's snow, and they went, yeah. And, Leif Erikson got blown off course and ended up in Miami. We would all be talking like this today. So what you see is you want to look for interesting failures, and failures are hugely important. A good example for me is we looked at the popularity, Second Life and MUDs. This is the first graphical MUD. Did anybody here remember Habitat from Lucasfilm? 1985, 2400 baud. It was a little slow and it didn't quite take off. And what happened, but it had all the elements of Second Life. You had currency, you could buy things, you could sell things, you could get married, you could create avatars. You just did it very slowly. And what it was followed by, there's some folks in this room who were involved in various of the efforts, one virtual world failure after another, until eventually we got to Second Life. And there's the inflection point, it takes off, and we all have seen Ed Castronova's brilliant work on the economy of Second Life, being the 72nd largest economy on the planet today, and it's a real enough virtual world that, there are people in walk-ups in Shanghai creating avatars in Worlds of Warcraft and things to auction off on eBay. So failures lead to interesting successes. But here's another one that touches on this media space. Apropos of Kindle, this was the first electronic book that I noticed. It was the electronic Bible from Franklin Computer, about 1986. Did anybody get one of these? To my great regret, I didn't buy one. It turned out it was a reference work. You didn't actually read the Bible out, but these sold very well. And by the way, that's a pretty consistent theme in the history of media. You do the Bible first, and then what do we do after you do the Bible? Cheap thrillers, how-to books, and pornography. Absolute constant thing. But you watch the route from this to the Kindle. And I know I got two Kindle grumps in this room, but the Kindle I figure they sold 500,000 Kindles. And Amazon is very happy with the Kindle. And there are some people who are passionate about the Kindle. My good friend Stuart Brand, who's busy writing a new book about the environment, he's downloading all his research material on the Kindle. Stuart could have any computer he wants, and he can have books shipped to him and stuff. He is using the Kindle for his research. And I first thought, when I bought the Kindle, I thought it was going to be the 128K Mac of the category. But it's not. It's the 512K Mac. Seriously, I mean, the 512K Mac, you could actually accomplish something, but it mostly you went, yeah, but I want it to do more. Well, we'll see what they come up with next week. But what I'm seeing happening is, way back in the 80s, I did a forecasts essay called The Electronic Pinata, and I argued that we were going to become paperless, but it was, in the short run, we were going to use more paper than ever, but eventually holes and thin spots on the pinata appear, and we end up going completely paperless. But not in the way people think. You know, whenever we do something new, we always imitate an old thing. And this is what's tricky about media, because we do it with media as well as physical objects. My favorite example, William Bakelin, 1907, did the first thermoset phenol formaldehyde resin, what we call plastic, first modern plastic. And what did people do once they had Bakelite? They spent their whole time trying to make it look like wood and tortoiseshell, because that's what people expected to see. And after about a decade of making it look like wood and tortoiseshell, they finally said, let's let plastic be plastic. And then things got interesting. Well, we do exactly the same thing with media. Think about email. Thank God Apple did not invent email. Because if Apple had invented email, you would have done everything like we normally do, and then it was time to hit send, an envelope would have appeared on screen, your note would have folded up 3 ways, slipped into the envelope would have shut, and then Apple would have expected you to lick the screen in order to send mail. This literal stuff that we're slowly moving beyond. The GUI interface is that literal Bakelite sort of thing. And the Kindle, I would argue, is the first successful Bakelite example in this new space. And what it's an indicator of is we're headed towards new media forms. And we know everybody's working on it.
So you didn't use the softbook, or the Rocket ebook, or
Yes,
Voyager, or
Yes. I have a softbook. I have a I have the softbook. I have the Rocket book. I have every single electronic book that was made.
How about Dynabook?
I keep waiting. Let's, tell Alan. Alan's got time on his hands. It's time to deliver the Dynabook. But I was a judge for the Frankfurt International eBook Awards in 2002. And we were supposed to look at all the different ebooks and ebook offerings and give prizes. Here's what happened with the judging committee. We all looked at them and they were so bad, we said, we're not giving out any awards. The sponsor, however, was Microsoft. And they said, fine, thank you very much, and they picked the awards and didn't tell us. So yeah, I've been through this. This is the first one that really works. And I mean, this isn't a conversation about this device, so I don't want to go into details on it, but here's where it's headed. This is one of the early concept drawings of the Apple Nano, or what was called the Safari Pad. And, it's one of the worst kept secrets in the Valley that the iPhone came out of a little project called Safari Pad at Apple. And of course, this is all hearsay, so I'm not revealing any confidences. I could be completely wrong. But some engineer had the bright idea, said, what I need is a device designed for ease of reading, not input, but output. And it's convenient, and I can carry it around like the Dynabook, carry it in 2 bags of groceries. And took it to Steve, and Steve said, this is brilliant and fantastic, but in that unique Steve Jobsian way, said, let's do the phone first. And that's why, in my opinion, I don't know about you all, but I haven't even gotten close to the bottom of all the undocumented features in my iPhone. And there's some stuff in that iPhone that doesn't make sense for any device that isn't at least this big. So, we'll see where it comes, but every single consumer electronics company on the planet is busy desperately trying to work on this new class of device. The way I think about it hypothetically is if I took my Mac Air, put it sideways, took a hacksaw, sawed right down the hinge, threw the part with the keyboard away, and kept the screen, and didn't have to worry about the battery, and assumed it was all connected to the network. Now we're getting to the new class of device. But think about this.
Wasn't that what the dynamo? Well, what's the name?
Yeah, I know.
They
but-
could have done it without him.
Well, whoever, but all I want is I want this thing. But pull back to the general sense. If you think about it, in this crazy media revolution, we have pushed the World Wide Web deep into being media, even though we're still stuck in the plastic stage of our computers. I mean, what is to me astounding about the World Wide Web is that we have to have a keyboard in front of us in order to visit the place, or a virtual keyboard in our hiding behind the screen or something. There's a penumbra in our devices. We have the big screens on our desk. You know, I got a 30-inch monitor and a tower under my desk. And then I have a laptop I carry around. And then there's this gap down to my iPhone and to cell phones. And like, there's a little hole right in the middle of the donut. Anybody who's had to travel on an airplane knows that that hole is there, because try and watch a movie on a laptop in coach when somebody tilts their seat back. It's crazy that we have that keyboard in front of us just because people see it. Well, my forecast is in the next 24 to 36 months, you're going to see a breakout. I don't know who's going to do it first. Sony's trying. I hope Apple's trying. You know, I mean, I don't know anything more than anybody else knows, but I would guess maybe. And that's when I think this personal media revolution is really going to start taking off. Now, the thing I look for are indicators, things that don't fit. The missing device in our life is one. Another indicator in this space is RFID. How many of you woke up this morning and said, my life is incomplete without a MEMS accelerometer? Come on, this is the Gates building. Somebody has to say yes. Well, you know, or how many of you use these?
By the way, you have one in your head.
An accelerometer, yes, I know, but it doesn't talk to the web. I mean, unless I do that.
That's your problem.
So how many of you have a little Polar cardio watch?
Looking at this audience?
Yeah, you're right. Okay, I take it back. Well, let me explain what this is. German company, you wear a cardio band that talks wirelessly to your watch. As you're running along, it collects your data, and you can upload it, if you're a geek, you can upload it to your computer. And that's what all these charts are. But these are not charts of my data. I went on to Flickr and Flickr and Facebook and uploaded these. These are, by the way, generally charts of single males in their 20s. And you ask, why are they putting this data on the computer, on the web for all to see? Anyone want to make a guess?
Because they don't have portions to show pictures of?
To get there, to get a date. This is what geeks say. The guy in the upper right is basically saying, look, I have a resting pulse just like Lance Armstrong's, and I'm not taking any drugs, so I'm a cute guy, I have a date. He probably photoshopped it. But you look at that sort of stuff, and you know, this is health technology, right? No, it's media. It's social media. You use it to get a date. And does it go mainstream? Well, how many of you woke up this morning and said, I want an accelerometer in my running shoes? Well, if you did, we could buy it for you because it's been out from Nike for over a year. One of the people who used to work at Apple's labs now is the head of product design at Nike, and they came out with a shoe that has a little pocket for an accelerometer that talks wirelessly to the iPod. And it does neat things if you're kind of a geek. If you're a runner and you start to bonk, you're slowing down. What this does is you preload your favorite inspirational music, and as you start to slow, your shoes say to the iPod, he's slowing down, switch to the Rocky theme song. and it literally is becoming media stuff because they have, oh no, did I do this wrong? Well, we're going to skip that slide because it's out of order. Here you go. It's gone mainstream. That Nike is selling enough of these that they're running ads in the running magazines that you can team up and and do virtual races against people and presumably use this to get a date. So this is a world where literally everything is information. The geekiest data coming off the geekiest device you can imagine can be repackaged as a slick commercial product, and the bits about your heart rate are not information, they're media. That's the kind of world we're in. And this just completes the slide that, it doesn't quite line up with this, but this decade, the arrival of cheap sensors is taking us into this world of smart effects, intelligent artifacts. This was a term coined by a guy at Apple who had something different in mind, but I think everything becomes a media object, literally. Your car becomes a media object, your phone's a media object. That's the kind of world we're headed into. Now, just some technology stuff behind this as a build to getting to what I really want to talk about. Every decade we have a new technology. And we usually ignore the technology, we look at its artifact. The 80s were shaped by the advent of cheap microprocessors, and the poster child was the personal computer. It was just the skin. We put around processors cheap enough to put one on everyone's desk. And by the way, you can always tell what the poster child is by, who's the face of the pimply-faced geek on the cover of Business Week. And then it was Wozniak and Gates and the like. The 90s was shaped by cheap lasers. Cheap communications lasers gave us fiber optic bandwidth, gave us CD-ROMs, and the poster child was the World Wide Web. This is stuff I talked about here a couple of years ago, so I won't go into details. This decade is being shaped by cheap sensors. I'm sorry to say to my web friends, the web is not the main event. The technology slipping into our lives unnoticed that's changing everything is sensors.
Sensor web.
Yeah, they all try and say sensor webs, but I don't buy that. It's cheap cameras, it's cheap RFID, it's MEMS accelerometers, it's all this stuff. So the 80s we created our computers. The 90s we networked them together, and we had this parallel universe of cyberspace that we visited by looking through the porthole of our computers. And in this decade, we're asking our computers to observe and manipulate the physical world on our behalf. And to me, it's a no-brainer what the next big thing is going to be, and that's robots. The next big thing in terms of the company that comes out of nowhere and makes a fortune, and the pimply-faced geek on the cover of the magazines is going to be a robot builder. We built the computers, we networked it together, we give them sensory organs, all you got to do is put wheels on the things and you got a robot. So I think that is going to be one of the really big shifts, and I think those robots are going to be media objects. They're already tools of discovery. Anybody here an amateur astronomer? As you will know, we used to name comets after people. And these days, like wonderful romantic names like Ikea Seiki or, Shoemaker Levy, these are the people who would stay up late at night and look at the sky and identify comets. And these amateurs are so passionate. There's one guy I know who moved into the Rocky Mountain states because he wanted to be a couple hours ahead of a friend he's been competing against in California. And since stars rise in the east, he figured he'd get a jump and get his note into the Bureau of Astronomical Telegram Service. Well, these days, most comets are called linear and then a number after a robotic telescope system in New Mexico. So we're already having robot media devices doing discovery and the like. But we also know the robot revolution is beginning down that S-curve. And a key indicator is this little guy from 2003, the Roomba. Anybody have a Roomba here? What's your Roomba's name?
It doesn't have a name.
You're in a minority. I remember in 2004 talking to the iRobot folks, and they said, it's a really weird thing. We've discovered that 2/3 of Roomba owners give their Roombas names. And 1/3 of Roomba owners admit to taking them on vacation with them or over to a friend's house to show off. And I had noticed something very strange here in the Valley, which was a bunch of my engineer friends were as stoked about the Roomba as they were about the 128K Mac. Except what was doubly weird about it is these were people who, in my recollection, never owned a vacuum cleaner. And to be excited about a vacuum cleaner and to give a vacuum cleaner a name, up here something else is going on. Well, of course, the Roomba is not really a robot. If anybody's taken it apart, It's just a pile of electronics pretending to be a robot. I mean, it is dumb, 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 dumb. Of course, that hasn't hurt iRobot from making serious money. Their real business is military bots. They have 2,000 pack bots in Iraq, excuse me. Give it time. And the U.S. government, the Pentagon has $2 billion set aside. I realize that's not a lot of money for the Pentagon, but they have $2 billion set aside to buy robots over the next 5 years for military uses. And there are probably 30,000 odd robots flying around Iraq and Afghanistan at the moment. They're called Predators. You don't fly a Predator like a model airplane. You give it a waypoint and say, call me when you get there. And then you go have coffee and the Predator tells you you're there. The first human being was killed by a robot in 2002. That was the first civilian death caused by a robot outside a theater of action. It was in Yemen. A couple of guys, we were told they were terrorists, who knows, in a little white Toyota, and a Predator with a Hellfire missile come out. So we already have killer robots. Lots of stuff going on. The other indication about this robot thing that I think is important is the DARPA Grand Challenge. Let me describe to you an interesting S-curve. The first DARPA Grand Challenge, May 2004, I was there as part of a team, and we were halfway down, at the midpoint on the racetrack, sitting there waiting to do support. And we kind of felt like idiots because it was a 150-mile course, 21 teams, and only 4 vehicles got anywhere. And the one that got furthest, Sandstorm, only got 7 miles before driving off the road and stalling out. And everybody felt a little sheepish, and they went, oh, I don't know, well, maybe we're a little early or overambitious. The second DARPA Grand Challenge, almost exactly 18 months later, was October 2005. 22 out of 23 finalists got farther than Sandstorm got in the first race, and 5 vehicles finished. Now, does that feel like an inflection point or not? But this race, the third Grand Challenge, and of course, I mean, I don't need to go into details here. The second race, of course, was won by Sebastian Thrun and the Stanford team. But the third race, the Urban Grand Challenge, which was it November 2007, was all the more remarkable. The robots were not just doing a course, they had to go into simulated town with some very brave volunteers driving cars and walking across the street in this whole thing. And what's amazing is that, enough vehicles finished that we discovered that, in fact, robots may be primitive, but they already understand the California Vehicle Code better than most humans.
That's easy.
And the proof of this is, for me as a forecaster, was I looked for coincidences. And the coincidence that happened with this was this. This was on Highway 99, just about 45 minutes before the start of the Urban Grand Challenge. There was an accident. 8 a.m., 250 miles to the north of the site, the old Air Force Base where the Grand Challenge was, 108 cars, 18 big rigs, driving at 80 miles an hour in the fog, like salmon, just instinctively going upstream. Couldn't see past the front of their car, and yet they're still driving at 80 miles an hour. One paramedic working this accident at the front said, we could hear the cars smashing into the back of this as we were pulling the injured out of the front of the accident. This is proof. People shouldn't drive. And it is proof. Sebastian Thrun, who will say he thinks that by 2030, half of all vehicle miles in the United States will be driven by robots. My reaction is, do we have to wait this long? It is nuts that we have this sort of thing. But I really do think robots are going to take off, and they're going to be part of this whole media revolution because they're sensing, they're interacting. We'll do the Bakelite phase thing, but then we'll get to a point where the vehicles just look like totally different experiences. I hope, personally, being raised in California and having a special bond with automobiles, they'll reserve some part of the Mojave Desert for people who want to have the guilty pleasure of driving around with an old internal combustion engine without any robotic prostheses. But, so let me just go back to this mass media shift. The difference between mass media and personal media. Mass media was a world of television. That was the technology. Personal media, the technology is the web. Mass media delivered the world to our living rooms. If you wanted to see things, you had to be in your living room to see the TV. Personal media delivers it everywhere. You can carry it in your pocket, you can hear it, we see it all sorts of ways. More importantly, mass media was a world where you watched and you consumed. Personal media is a world where you participate and create. So think back to that age of television. The most amazing things came into your living room, but all you could do is press your nose against the glass and watch. You couldn't answer back. How many people would shout at the TV? Or in a mass media world, the idea of interaction was you wrote a letter to the editor of the local newspaper, and they got hundreds of letters, and they printed 2, and they edited the daylights out of them, so it didn't even sound like you when you got there. And the only way you participated was you watched the ads and you went out and you bought something. That's hugely important. You'll see why in a few moments. In a world of personal media, you participate. The example of Google I gave earlier. If you don't put something into Google, you don't get anything out. But above all, the deeper activity here, in the world of mass media you consumed, in the world of personal media, you create. The world of mass media was the world of the few and the large. The world of personal media is the world of the many and the small. Now, what I do not mean, most emphatically, is I do not mean that big companies, it's over. I mean, at the moment, that sort of looks like things are happening. No, I think in the world of personal media, there will be companies that will dwarf Google in size. That will dwarf the largest of the media companies even before they started shrinking 2 months ago. But the way you'll get big is by engaging the many and the small. Think about Google. That Google got as big as it did because all of us use it. All of us participate in the Google search process. That's what gives value to Google. Because if we didn't do our searches, Google wouldn't be able to do page ranking and it wouldn't be able to do AdSense and it wouldn't get large. And right in there, the danger with new media is to avoid simplistic conclusions. 100 years ago when the phonograph arrived, there were people, and that was the beginnings of mass media. And a lot of people said, this is great, because in a story that Alan Kay told long ago, he said, what happened was everybody said, gosh, with the phonograph, before the phonograph, every town large enough to have its own tenor had an opera house and a tenor, and there were all these tenors all over the United States singing their hearts out for little tiny audiences. And with the phonograph, the visionaries of the phonograph said, this is great. Everybody is going to be able to listen to all of those tenors out there. You're right. What happened is a whole bunch of tenors were out of a job because everybody just wanted to listen to Caruso. So you had the Caruso effect of this technology that looked like it was personal, but it ended up being a powerful mass media. I think the opposite sort of thing is now happening with personal media. The way you get big is you empower the many and the small. And therein is this piece I see happening with the economy. Go back 100 years if you want to understand the next 50, because I think we're right at the seam between two economies. 100 years ago, we had an industrial economy, a newly emergent industrial economy. We'd had all the 1800s, we started getting all these wonderful things. We had a working class, we had an emergent middle class, and the great industrialists of the time were completely preoccupied with finding a way to make stuff. To make enough stuff, cheaply enough, to satisfy the newly awakened desires of that working class. It was an economy of abundance on the surface. In fact, beneath it, it was an economy of scarcity. That's why during World Wars I and World War II, we rationed. And so the preoccupation of that economy was manufacturing efficiency. The central actor in that economy was the worker, the person who made stuff. And in my opinion, in my model, the symbol of that economy is what's in this picture, the time clock. And all the preoccupations of the industrial economy were efficiency, taking scarce stuff, making it abundant. The management books of the time, when's the last time somebody read Fred Taylor in this room? Principles of Scientific Management, 1912. It's a short little book. I really recommend you go back and read it. He's the guy who did the time and motion studies. We all know the Hawthorne effect, the Hawthorne wire works. His whole preoccupation was, how do you get efficiencies? And it's like reading something from the 1500s. There's a whole chapter devoted to the problem of soldiering. Anyone want to guess what soldiering was? Come on, has anybody ever slacked off in this room? Think about it. Soldiering is like, you're all standing in a line. Don't get out in front of the other guy. Like, all kind of hang back. The boss says work faster. You just kind of hang back. That's soldiering. So this whole economy, for 50 years to the mid-century, was preoccupied with how do you create abundance out of scarcity? How do you take resources? How do you make them in product, make them available? But we knew scarcity was there. We rationed. And at the end of World War II, something very interesting happened. During World War II, all the companies in this country shifted over to making bombers and munitions and tanks. The war ends and they go back to making consumer products. And two very interesting things happened at the end of the war. The first one was everybody was prepared for another return to the Depression. Something to keep in mind today. 1929 hit, Roosevelt comes in, does what he can to get the country back on its feet. But let's face it, the economy really didn't come back until you had the influx of the demands of World War II. So everyone said, the war's over, we're dead meat, we're going back to a recession. No, there was a little bitty recession, but really that forecast never happened. But a second thing happened, and that is the companies had gotten so good in those intervening 50 years of making stuff, they discovered to their horror that they could now make more stuff than people wanted. And that was the end of the industrial economy. Most economies, in my opinion, are done in by their success, not their failure. And the industrial economy was done in because we got so good at making stuff. The economy ended, and the actor of that economy was replaced by someone new in a completely new economy. It was the consumer economy. The consumer economy was a fundamental shift in power. And no coincidence, it happened in the 1950s, right around the arrival of television. The central actor in this economy was no longer the worker, the person who made things, but the consumer, the person who purchased things. And the symbol of this economy was no longer the time clock, that symbol of efficiency, but the credit card, then called the charge card, that newly discovered tool that empowered people to purchase. We take credit cards so for granted today. It's a distant memory. Most of us were not alive then. But if you wanted to buy a refrigerator before the invention of the credit card, you went to the bank for a loan. With the credit card, you got the loan automatically at the moment of purchase. And power shifted in a fundamental way, away from the people who produced, the VPs of manufacturing, to those who inflamed consumer desire, the VP of sales, the VP of marketing. And the consumer society, or consumer economy, was fundamentally different from the industrial economy. What did we do during the Vietnam War? We most certainly did not ration. In fact, the joke during the Vietnam era is, for God's sake, if you're a patriotic American, consume more. Because if you consume less, it'll hurt the economy and impair our ability to produce napalm to kill Vietnamese. So the consumer economy was all about a new kind of scarcity, and the scarcity was desire. The industrial economy was about the scarcity of stuff. The consumer economy was overcoming the scarcity of desire. We kept inflaming people's desires. And guess what? The consumer economy was just done in by its success. Black Sunday, September 17th, 1998, was the moment at which we reached the logical break point that consumer desires had gone so far beyond the ability of consumers to pay, even with credit cards. Something had to break. The consumer economy was done in by its success. And in my opinion, it's being replaced by a new kind of economy. That's an economy that is typified by some of our new internet companies. So the web phenomena, in some ways, hasn't begun, and in other ways, is actually much, much bigger than we can imagine. The new central actor in this economy is not the person who produces, the worker, nor the person who consumes, the consumer, the person who produces. A new economic animal that does both activities in the same single act. Thank you, Macintosh. God almighty. Okay, thank you. If Apple's listening, I love X. I can't wait for the new OS. But the two things I would love is, could you find a way to selectively turn off the hot corners? Because I always hit on finding, and it's like, no. Sorry, end of rant. So this is economy, the new, in my opinion, the new central actor in this economy is the creator, not the creative. Creatives are elites. Creatives make things we want to buy to hang on to our walls, or they make that we want to watch. And they, creatives, you go down to Hollywood and they're the ones that go, hey, sweetie, sweetie, baby, baby, let's do lunch. Have your girl call my girl. And they, wear gold chains and their shirts are unbuttoned halfway to their navels. They're elites. We're creators. And the creator economy is emerging through things like this. Before YouTube, if you wanted to broadcast a video, you had to work for one of the networks and have lots of money. Before Wikipedia, if you wanted to do an encyclopedia entry, you had to be a certified real smart person or be an employee of Encyclopedia Britannica, and so on. But, of course, the most important act, those are cases where they're a little traditional. Wikipedia, less than 1% of the people who consult Wikipedia actually put in entries. It kind of looks like a democratic form of traditional publishing. And MySpace, YouTube, the ratio of people putting videos to watching videos is a little better, but let's face it, most of us just watch stuff we don't produce. Now, the classic creator example is Google. I set my settings on my screen wrong. Google still is spelled with an E. Don, what was your Google subscription last month? 0, he says. Now, you and I both remember when Lockheed Dialog and LexisNexis, we had to pay to search. And I can remember being a little grad student here at Stanford, being hauled into the dean's office because I had managed to run up a really big bill on LexisNexis. One of my classmates from that era is here, and I bet you he remembers me bitching about it. Isn't that really odd? We used to have to pay for search. And now it's free. Or is it? Thank you, sir. You are paying for your searches. Google is diabolical. You are paying and you don't even realize it. You're paying with that search string you put in. Because, of course, that search string, which you think is valueless, when combined with all the other search strings stringing in, enables their business model. So you're giving something that you don't even realize you're creating something. You think you're just consuming, but they make you create before you consume. That's the essence of the creator economy. It's the same single act. We're entered into a world where we think we're getting something out, but in fact we're creating something. And there are other instances where we think we're creating something, but in fact we're consuming something else. And we are just barely beginning to see the shape. Now, by the way, I mentioned this is the world of the many and the small, and figure out who's going to be the biggest company around. So an old friend of mine, John Kelly, is here. John is a guy who's not afraid of doing serious writing, and we're old friends. And so I say to John, we're old friends. Would you write something for me? He says, sure, what do you want? I said, well, I started thinking about an 850-page book, kind of like, Michael Porter, Competitiveness. And he goes, hey, that's not, okay, I take it back. John, you're middle-aged and you're white, so why don't you do one of those, it'd be easy for you, one of those 250-page management books that middle-aged white guys like to write. And he says, well, yeah, but talk to my agent, we can work out the deal. I said, okay, that's way too formal. How about a 20-page paper? John's done more 20-page papers than I've done. And he said, well, yeah, if it's an interesting topic, and I can get around to it in a couple months. Okay, take it back. How about a one-page summary? In fact, not even a one-page, how about a paragraph? In fact, not even a paragraph. Give me haiku. Give me 17 syllables, and it doesn't even have to rhyme. Give me a search string. He says, sure, I'll do that right now. That's the secret to the creator economy. The way the companies will become biggest are the ones who can harness the smallest quantum of creative act. There is a company out there somewhere emerging that will be bigger than Google. And I don't know who they are, and I don't know who's running it, but I do know what they'll do. They will harness a single click. That's the essence of the creator economy. Now, I realize I've talked to 5:15. I will get around to why the U.S. won't exist, but I think this would be a good time to stop and take some questions, if people have questions.
Are you saying the U.S. won't exist, sort of all what Neil Stephenson did in Snow Crash?
I'll come back. Let me do an article. Hold that question. So it's stuff I've talked about so far. Is there anything that just seems totally bogusly wrong? John. So it's going to be a 20-page paper and 800?
No, I'll give you about 2 sentences. I think you're quite right about there being a lot of historical antecedents that go back to World War II. If you really want to think about the economy changing in more fundamental terms, I think you need to focus less on the Googles of the world and more on sort of the energy, material aspects of production, because I think that's really what is changing. And I think it would be, I think the latter part of the talk, if this is a work in progress, is really very interesting. But the area where I encourage you to think more is how you didn't say anything really about population, but, Gus Speth is a guy I'd recommend if you're not familiar with his work, you probably are. But you start looking at the material constraints on the economy, and I think those things are real. I think you're quite right about the role of credit in that, but it's also credit running up against some very serious material constraints. Well, I think that's going to shape the material underpinnings of the economy as much as it's going to shape the...
So everyone heard John's observation? I apologize. So he was saying, I think you're right, that looking at the energy stuff and population things, think about the creator economy, because I've started to think about that, it's some way where the trend over the last 50 years has been to dematerialize stuff. We have increasingly substituted bits for atoms, to use terms popularized by Nick Negroponte. Your car has more horsepower per pound than your car 10 years ago had. So we're starting to put bits in place of stuff in a couple of places. And so I think there's a lot going on here. I also think, the other place where we need to substitute bits is for electrons. Think about the information revolution. Most electrons, 99.9% of all electrons in our lives, are really dumb electrons. They're lighting these things. Imagine if every electron had smarts embedded in it. There's, an electron's a terrible thing to waste. Sir?
I was wondering about the gap in machines, between the laptop and the iPhone. Do you think there's any possibility of eyeglass displays, for example?
Well, surely possibilities of eyeglass displays.
They exist, but they've never caught on. Is that fundamental, or might they?
I'm not particularly qualified to answer the question. I do know everybody keeps trying to do it. There is actually a pretty couple of pairs in Japan and Korea that are selling pretty well for watching video. Unfortunately, for folks like you and me who wear glasses and over 50, where your vitreous humor starts to firm up, it's not quite as good an experience for us as if we were back in our 20s, but hopefully somebody in medicine will solve that.
Well, that's a matter of following the SPIE conferences. I mean, Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible, where he did that.
Can everybody hear?
Yeah.
Okay, that's one thing. The adjective I was curious about you using, though, for economies, though, from the industrial economy, like, if Vint Cerf were here, I know what he would ask. And the one adjective you haven't used in front of the word economy is service economy. There's a lot of people who believe economies really only deal with products. They're the naive. They haven't bought into the service economy idea, much less the intellectual economy of the creativity you're talking about here. I was wondering if you might address that transition from the 40s and the 50s.
Well, it's funny, the service economy notion was one that was very popular in the late 1980s, sort of 87, 88. It was Business Week talked a lot about it. What I see as a forecaster is even the most expected of futures tends to arrive in unexpected ways. And so the service economy notion at the time in the 80s was everybody would become a consultant, and anybody who wasn't a knowledge worker would be flipping burgers at McDonald's. Well, the service economy we got was the economy of offshoring and outsourcing and the changing nature of a job. How many people in this room have a full-time job? Hold on, keep your hands up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, that's about right. It turns out only about 30% of Americans have a full-time job. The rest of us don't have jobs. We have gigs. Think about it. Think about explaining, what we have is gigs. And you have multiple gigs, and you patch your gigs together into a career. That's the sort of stuff that's coming out of the service economy, in my opinion. But I don't think it's an economy that sort of...
So I keep thinking about the way you're referring to Google, and it's not working for me. Because Google seems like the culmination of two constructs that have been around a really long time. One is channel surfing, and the other is the audience meter. So that creativity I'm talking about is a really sophisticated audience meter in a very fine-grained environment. And so given the progression you were trying to paint, I think of Google as being the culmination of the old web, which was a publishing environment, and things like wikis and blogs and such as indicating this real peer-to-peer. As you were talking about peer-to-peer, primary instantiation of peer-to-peer so far is a client-server environment done in large scale. The fact that we will eventually be able to talk to each other really directly rather than having to be mediated by a server, that's not so much yet. It will be, but it isn't.
Yeah, well, you won't get an argument from me on that. I agree. In many ways, Google does represent the end of an old order, as well as being an indicator of the beginning of something else. It was, that small tweak on the model that I think, this creator economy is just starting to emerge. So in many ways, it's a little bit like, the shift of the media companies into television. So you had the RCAs of this world and the beginnings of TV in the 1950s, where they had a big piece in the past and they were putting a small piece into the future. So yeah, I think Google's just the start. But it does have a big, and Google has a fascination with old media. That's why they're digitizing books. Other questions?
I think people are still waiting for what the United States is.
Oh, right. All right, okay, good. So we got about 5 minutes left. So here's my hypothesis, that there are a lot of really interesting indicators of a fundamental shift going on. And the shift, in my opinion, is this, that in the 20th century, the dominant entity in international affairs and politics and governance was the nation state. And in fact, until about 1953, in classical international law, a nation state had exclusivity as a person in international law, which is lawyers speak for saying, if you ain't a nation state, you have no voice. You can't play in this. And then the United Nations had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and some other things came along, and suddenly we started seeing the so-called NGOs. They were non-governmental entities, but they had a voice in international affairs. And so we started fudging the exclusivity of the nation state. What's happened with globalization, in my opinion, is we're well into a shift. If the 20th century was shaped by the nation state, the 21st century, the century we are in, the central actor is the city-state. And you can take the nation-state and you think of it as a unitary thing, but in fact it's a bundle of competencies. There's an economic competency, there's a military competency, cultural competency, and we're breaking that bundle apart. Places like, go into Brussels and walk up to somebody on the street and say, "Who are you?" He said, "Well, politically I carry an EU passport. Economically, the European community, I have euro in my pocket or my debit card. Militarily, I'm protected by NATO. Culturally, I identify with the European Song Contest. And, I Walloon." So what about Belgium? Oh, right. I guess I'm part of Belgium. We fought a war over Belgium barely 100 years ago. And now it's like, right now Belgium doesn't have a government because nobody can agree on it. And so there's a lot of, everybody's falling apart. But what is clear is Brussels. And what we see are city-states, either de facto city-states like Singapore, which has status as a nation and a permanent representative at the UN, or Dubai, or Abu Dhabi. But then there are virtual city-states, like California, like the Bay Area. And in my opinion, the city-state is what matters because it's the political entity that is large enough to have a global impact. Look at what Silicon Valley's done for the world. But small enough that everybody identifies with their contribution locally. A city-state is a place where your captains of industry and the like are, Steve. All the people who've never met Steve Jobs, but they don't call him Mr. Jobs, they call him Steve in the Bay Area. Of course, I guess we call Obama, never mind. So much for that analogy. But 2 years ago, there was an indicator of this for me. The Republican president of the United States, George Bush, asked the Republican governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, to send the California National Guard to the Mexican border to protect America against terrorists sneaking across the border and provide security. And what did the Republican governor say to the Republican president? No. And 2 weeks later, at a press conference on the shores of the Pacific Ocean in Long Beach, California, the same Republican governor had a press conference with a real head of state, Tony Blair, announcing a joint policy between California and, let's see here, leave it there for the moment, because I have one last slide. A notice, press conference, joint policy with Tony Blair in the United Kingdom over global climate change in direct opposition to the Republican president. That's quite astounding. That would have been unheard of even 10 years ago. So the United States is already beginning to loosen up and go its own way. And, you saw the red state, blue state thing going on. And this notion, ask anybody what being an American is, usually means their regional definition. A gay in San Francisco has a very different vision of what America is compared to a conservative white southern guy in Alabama. So the United States is already beginning to come apart. And I think that what we're going to see is a world of nation states. And a world of city states. And that nation states are already dropping in importance, and it's going to accelerate. And the only question in the case of the United States is how we come apart, not whether we come apart. Is it kind of an easygoing, Europeans are from Venus kind of thing, like the EU, and we share a song contest and cooperate? Or is it the South will rise again and, sort of a Kosovo, Yugoslavia kind of breakup? Though my suspicion is if the South decides to secede from the Union, everybody this time will say, it's been great. So that's what I think is already happening. Sir?
Is it going to be separated though by territory, by physical locality, or is it going to be separated more by mentality of thinking along the lines of, it's an information economy where we go online and communicate with people throughout the world? Is that
Great question. Where does territory matter? City-states do have territory. City-states are often, the power is determined by the hinterlands they control. So Shanghai controls the Yangtze up as far as Nanjing. Hong Kong, a classic city-state, really sits at the head of the Pearl River Delta. The Bay Area has, it either includes or excludes Sacramento. I haven't asked Sacramento lately. So territory matters. But also, part of what makes the nation-state less and less relevant is the dramatic mobility of people. 1/5 of single people in the United Kingdom go online to date people from outside their country. And so we start seeing that kind of thing begin to happen where the ties binding people to geography is changing. There's a piece I just did in the Harvard Business Review this month where I argue that we're on the edge of an American diaspora. Forget about trying to attract people from offshore to work in the United States. What we're going to see happen here is Americans, just as people in this room, your kids grew up to work across on the other side of the country, the kids coming out of school today are going to spend a significant portion of their career living abroad. If they're lucky and they're smart enough to do so. That Americans are going to be moving abroad for jobs. Moving up, the notion of living inside the country you were born is going to become as antiquated as living in the city or state. And it's not a forecast, it's already happening.
Well, did you see the billboard by the Chinese government saying look at China?
Oh, yeah.
So you saw that, yeah.
Yeah.
The question I have is, since you ran...
This was a billboard, it's on 101 in San Carlos, saying, come to Taiwan, we have great industrial...
Oh, that wasn't Taiwan. That was .gov.cn.
Oh, it was. It was very much... Oh, then that's another one besides, because this was a Taiwan industrial park.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
No, the question I had, since you mentioned Sacramento...
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.